Lyrix's heart pounded in her chest as she crouched low in the thick jungle underbrush. The air was humid and thick, but her senses were sharper than ever. She had heard something. Footsteps, slow and heavy, cutting through the dense foliage. She wasn't sure how long she'd been on this desolate planet, but the desperation in her gut told her it had been too long. The crash had been violent, and her injuries had worsened with every passing day. Still, her survival instincts refused to let her give up. Her species had always been cautious around humans. For generations, the stories told by the elders had painted them as ruthless, carnivorous creatures, beasts with sharp teeth who hunted weaker species for sport. Lyrix had always found these stories hard to believe, but now, in this jungle with no one to help her, the fear had become real. Humans were the last thing she wanted to encounter. She glanced up at the thick trees above her, feeling the sweat dripping down her face. Her knife, a crude piece of metal she had fashioned from a broken piece of ship debris, felt small in her trembling hand. Her mind raced with a mix of fear and confusion. She was alone on this strange planet, her crew either dead or missing, and all she had was herself. But what if those stories were true? What if this human, if it was even a human, was here to hunt her? Another sound, this time closer, caused her pulse to quicken. The footsteps were now less than 100 feet away. Panic surged through her. She didn't know what to do. Should she run? Hide? Fight? Her breath hitched as the figure came into view. A tall human soldier emerged from the trees. He wasn't a creature like she had imagined. No fangs or claws, nothing like the bloodthirsty monsters in the stories. Instead, he wore dark tactical armor, with a helmet that obscured most of his face, leaving only his eyes visible. His weapon, a high-tech rifle, was slung across his back, and his gaze scanned the environment with military precision. Lyrix froze, watching every movement. Her heart thudded in her ears as she fought the overwhelming urge to flee. She gripped her knife tighter, ready to defend herself. The human's eyes swept across the clearing, and he paused for a moment, his gaze briefly landing on the spot where she was hiding. It was as though he could sense her, despite the thick vegetation between them. He spoke in a language she didn't understand, his voice calm and steady. He said something again, but she couldn't make sense of the words. The only thing she knew was that he was too close, and she was too exposed. Fear surged through her, louder than any logical thought. She had to act now. Without thinking, she lunged from her hiding place, throwing the sharp stone knife with all her strength. It soared through the air with surprising speed, but the human was faster. He dodged to the side with ease, his reflexes much sharper than she expected. The knife hit the ground with a dull thud just inches from his boots. The human didn't seem frightened. In fact, he didn't seem much of anything, just focused. He took a step back, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. His body language was calm, non-threatening, as though he didn't consider her a threat at all. But to Lyrix, it didn't matter. She had attacked, and now she had to fight for her life. There was no way she would let a human get the best of her. "Hey," the human spoke again, his voice surprisingly soft, almost like he was trying to reassure her. Lyrix couldn't understand his words, but his tone was calm, and something about it made her hesitate. He wasn't angry, not yet. He didn't sound like a hunter, just confused. Did he think she was the threat? Her heart raced, but this time, the fear wasn't just about the human. It was the fear of the unknown, the fear of making the wrong move. Was this a trap? Was she about to make the same mistake her elders had warned her about? Without taking her eyes off him, she slowly reached down to pick up another rock from the ground. Her mind raced. There had to be a way to escape, to survive. She wasn't going to let herself be caught by a human. The stories were clear. Humans would do anything to survive. They would devour her if they got the chance. The man took another step back, lowering his hand slowly. He wasn't coming closer, but he wasn't retreating either. He was waiting. Why was he waiting? Her knife had missed its mark. and now there was an awkward stillness in the air. He wasn't threatening her, at least not in the way she'd expected. Yet he was still human, and every fiber of her being screamed that he was dangerous. Then he did something unexpected. He spoke again, a series of words that still made no sense to her, but this time he stepped away from the spot where he had been standing. He moved with deliberate slowness, placing something on the ground in front of her, a small package wrapped in a rugged material she didn't recognize. At first, Lyrics didn't move. Was it a trap? A bait? Her instincts screamed at her to run, but there was something about the way he left it there. No hidden weapons, no aggression. The human turned to leave, slowly retreating into the forest, never once looking back at her. The silence of the jungle returned, and for a long moment, Lyrics stayed hidden, her breath still quick and shallow. She couldn't make sense of what had just happened. He had given her food, or maybe supplies. But why? Why hadn't he attacked? Curiosity won over fear. Her stomach growled, and her body reminded her that she was alone and starving. Cautiously, Lyrics inched toward the package he had left behind, her every step deliberate, as if the ground beneath her might explode at any moment. Her fingers trembled as she unwrapped it. Inside was a medkit, filled with healing ointments, bandages, and what looked like energy bars. Was this his plan? To leave supplies behind as a way of luring her in? Or was this something else? She didn't know, but she was desperate, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to take a breath and examine what she had been given. She opened the ration bar, and the taste, though strange to her, was comforting. It was food, and it would help her survive. Lyrics couldn't explain it. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Maybe the human wasn't what she had been taught to fear. Maybe there was more to the story. The stories, after all, had never been about survival. They had been about fear, and fear alone. But this felt different. The question lingered in her mind as she consumed the food and took the first real breath of relief she'd had in what felt like forever. Who was this human, and why had he spared her? Lyrics could hardly believe what had just happened. After the brief encounter with the human soldier, she had expected the worst. She had braced herself for a quick and brutal end. But instead of an attack, she had been given supplies. The medkit and food were enough to ease the pain of her wounds and hunger, but there was still an uneasy feeling gnawing at her. Why had he helped her? The stories she had grown up with painted humans as merciless predators, and yet here she was, standing on a strange planet with her life spared. As she sat under the thick canopy of trees, nibbling on the strange energy bar, her mind kept replaying the moment. The human hadn't killed her, hadn't even threatened her. The tension in her body that had been building for days seemed to ease, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of confusion. This wasn't what she had been told. The humans she had heard about were cunning, ruthless, and without mercy. They attacked first and asked questions later. And yet, the one who had crossed her path had done the opposite. She tried to make sense of the encounter. Maybe he had been planning to kill her all along, but then something changed. Maybe he had seen her weakness and decided she was no longer a threat. She had heard rumors about humans being strategic hunters, using their prey's fear to control them. But still, something didn't sit right. He hadn't been hunting. He had left her supplies, not traps. Lyrics glanced at the medkit in her lap, her fingers tracing the edges of the packaging. It wasn't just any kit. It looked like it had been used before, worn with signs of travel and hardship. Her heart pounded a little faster as she began to understand that this wasn't just a casual act of kindness. This soldier, or whatever he was, had been in this jungle for a while. He was just as stranded as she was, and yet he had chosen to help her. Why? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of rustling in the distance. She froze, her body stiffening, as her senses immediately shifted back into survival mode. Was he coming back? Had he seen her use the medkit? Was this a trap? Was he just waiting for her to let her guard down? The rustling grew louder. She quickly stood up, clutching the medkit tightly against her chest, ready to flee if needed. She scanned the area, trying to see. Through the dense underbrush, her heart raced again, and her eyes darted from shadow to shadow, waiting for the moment when the human would appear, this time, perhaps with a weapon raised. But as the noise drew closer, she realized something. It wasn't the human. It was something else, something much larger. The ground beneath her seemed to shake with each step, and she could hear the growls now, low and menacing. Her blood ran cold. There was no mistaking that sound. It was a predator, and it wasn't human. Her heart skipped a beat. She had heard rumors of these creatures, the giant, carnivorous beasts that roamed the jungle. They were known to hunt anything that moved, and they didn't care if it was human or alien. She moved quickly, ducking behind a large boulder for cover. Her breathing became shallow as she pressed herself against the rough surface, trying to keep quiet. She had to stay hidden, no matter what. The creature was drawing closer, its heavy footsteps shaking the ground beneath her. She couldn't afford to make a sound. The last thing she wanted was to draw its attention. The growls grew louder, and then she heard it, a loud crash, followed by the unmistakable sound of something breaking through the trees. It was coming straight toward her. She could feel the vibrations in the air as the creature's presence became more and more real. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the growls stopped. Lyrics held her breath, listening intently. Had it gone? Was it waiting, trying to lure her out? She didn't dare move. The jungle was silent, save for the wind rustling through the leaves. She strained her ears, but all she could hear was the distant hum of the jungle's creatures. The beast had vanished. But as the moments passed, she began to feel something else, something she hadn't noticed before. The atmosphere had shifted. She wasn't alone. It was him, the human. He had somehow managed to sneak past the predator, moving with a stealth and precision she hadn't expected. He wasn't standing directly in front of her, but she could hear his movements behind the trees. The human had somehow understood the danger, and now, in the midst of the jungle's deadly creatures, he was the one who was protecting her. Lyrics's mind raced. Could he really be trusted? Could this human be her ally, even after everything she had been taught? The stories from her childhood had painted them as enemies, yet here he was, risking his own life to keep her safe. The soldier's voice broke through the silence, low and controlled. "It's gone," he said, his words almost a whisper, but Lyrics could hear the calmness in his tone. "You're safe now." She hesitated before stepping out from behind the boulder, unsure of what to do. Should she thank him? Should she run? But as she moved forward, she found herself looking directly at him. His armor was slightly scuffed from the terrain, and his face, though mostly hidden by his helmet, had a hard expression. Yet there was something in his eyes, something that made her pause. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice barely more than a breath. The human soldier tilted his head slightly, as though considering the question for a moment before responding. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply, his tone flat but genuine. "We're not so different, you and I. Both of us are stranded here, with no one but ourselves to rely on." Lyrics didn't know how to respond. It felt like a lie, but the sincerity in his voice made her doubt her own instincts. Maybe this human wasn't like the others. Maybe he was something different. Her mind swirled with confusion. Was he just being kind to her for some reason she didn't understand? Or was he trying to manipulate her in some way? The silence between them stretched, and she glanced around, trying to decide what to do next. She had always been taught to trust no one, especially not a human. But now, she wasn't so sure. The human, noticing her uncertainty, took a small step toward her. "I know this is hard for you to understand," he said, "but you don't have to fight me. I'm not your enemy." For the first time since the crash, Lyrics felt a small flicker of hope. It was faint, but it was there. Perhaps this wasn't the beginning of her death, but the start of something else. Something new. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. The human nodded, his eyes scanning the jungle as if to make sure they were still safe. "We'll get through this together," he said, and in that moment, for the first time, Lyrics believed him. The jungle was alive with sounds, shifting leaves, distant animal calls, and the low hum of a planet unfamiliar to Lyrics. She had spent most of her life on the well-guarded homeworld of her people, protected from the harshness of unknown planets. Yet now she found herself stranded on an alien world, facing dangers she had never imagined. And, inexplicably, she wasn't alone. The human soldier moved through the dense undergrowth with surprising ease. His movements were deliberate, careful, and calculated, as if he knew this wild and dangerous jungle better than anyone else. Lyrics had once been told that humans were reckless, fighting with all their might without thinking ahead. Yet, as she followed him through the trees, it became clear that the stories were not true. He moved with purpose, scanning the area, looking for threats that were hidden to her. They had been walking for hours, and the heat of the planet's twin suns had begun to drain her energy. The light filtered through the thick canopy above, casting long shadows on the ground. But the air was still heavy with humidity. Sweat beaded on Lyrics's forehead, and her injured leg throbbed with every step, but she didn't dare show weakness. Not yet, not in front of him. He had kept silent for most of the walk, but she could feel his presence. It was as if he was waiting for her to speak, waiting for her to ask something, anything. She was still unsure about him, but she had to admit that the human silence made her feel both safe and uncomfortable. Was this how humans were? She had only known of them through stories and whispers, but here, in the flesh, he was different, calm, calculated, and dependable. She finally broke the silence. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. The question had been building in her mind for hours, and now it escaped before she could stop it. The soldier glanced over his shoulder, offering a brief nod. "There's a safe place nearby. It's a small shelter I found when I first crash-landed here. It's the only place we can rest without worrying about predators." His voice was calm, and there was no hesitation in his words, as if he had spoken them many times before. Lyrics raised an eyebrow, surprised at how confident he sounded. She had never imagined humans could be so organized. Her people had always thought of them as chaotic, driven by instinct and emotion. But the human soldier's demeanor seemed anything but impulsive. There was a method to everything he did, a reason behind each of his actions. As they walked, Lyrics's thoughts began to drift back to their earlier encounter with the beast. The way he had saved her from the predator's sharp claws was still fresh in her mind. She had expected the human to leave her behind, to watch as she was consumed by the creature. But instead, he had fought off the beast without hesitation. And then he had helped her, given her food, medical supplies, and the promise of safety. She had been taught to always expect the worst, to assume that any encounter with a human would be a struggle for survival. Yet everything she had experienced so far had defied those expectations. The soldier wasn't trying to kill her, nor was he trying to exploit her weakness. Instead, he was offering his assistance, even though they were strangers. Lyrics couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to him. There had to be a reason behind his actions. Humans didn't act out of kindness. At least, that's what her people had always believed. They fought, they killed, they conquered. That's how they survived. That's what the stories told her. So why had this one human gone against everything she knew? The soldier finally stopped and turned to face her. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low, almost amused. Lyrics felt her heart skip a beat. How could he know? "I'm thinking about what?" she asked, trying to hide the unease in her voice. He shrugged, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "You're wondering why I helped you, aren't you? You're thinking that there must be something in it for me." Lyrics stiffened, surprised by his insight. She hadn't said anything, but somehow he had seen through her thoughts. She didn't respond at first, unsure of what to say. But after a moment, she decided to be honest. "I've been taught to never trust humans," she admitted. "You're supposed to be enemies, predators who take what they want. The human looked at her for a long moment, his gaze intense but not unfriendly. "I'm not like the ones you've been taught about," he said simply. "I'm not here to take anything from you. I'm just trying to survive, like you. If I can help you, I will." No strings attached. Lyrics felt a knot form in her stomach. Was it really that simple? Could she really trust him? Her mind was clouded with doubts. Everything in her upbringing had told her that no human could be trusted. And yet here was this one, standing before her, offering his help with no clear motive. She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. She had to focus on the present, on their survival. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said quietly, "but I'll follow you for now. I don't have any other choice." The soldier nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "Fair enough. I'm not asking for your trust, just your cooperation. We both want to get out of here alive, right?" Lyrics didn't answer immediately. She couldn't. Trust wasn't something she could just give away, not easily. She had to be careful. But for now, he was the only ally she had. And perhaps, just perhaps, he wasn't as dangerous as the stories had made humans out to be. They continued their journey through the jungle, and as the day wore on, Lyrics began to notice something else. Despite herself, despite her doubts, she was starting to feel a strange sense of security in the soldier's presence. He moved with confidence, scanning their surroundings, always aware of potential dangers. He had a calmness about him that she couldn't help but admire. In the silence that followed, she found herself reflecting on their past. How many other humans were out there in the galaxy, each with their own reasons for survival? Were they all like the stories said? Were they all as ruthless and dangerous? Or was this human just one anomaly among many? The thought disturbed her. How could she possibly know the truth? All she had were her own experiences, and right now, her experience with this soldier was one of unexpected cooperation. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow across the jungle. The soldier pointed ahead, where a structure could be seen in the distance. It was a small, makeshift shelter hidden among the trees. "That's where we'll stay for the night," he said. Lyrics nodded, relieved to see a place that seemed safe. It wasn't much, but it was better than wandering through the jungle. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance they could make it out of this alive. As they reached the shelter, the soldier motioned for her to enter first. He had already set up a small campfire inside, and the warmth was a welcome relief from the chill of the evening air. "Rest," he said. "We'll need to be ready for whatever comes next." Lyrics didn't say anything. She simply nodded and sat down beside the fire. There was still so much she didn't understand, so much she hadn't yet figured out. But for now she had a new ally, one she wasn't sure she trusted, but one who had kept her alive so far. As the fire crackled and the jungle night settled in around them, Lyrics couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that the human soldier was somehow a part of it. And for better or worse, they were in this together. The night in the jungle had grown darker, with only the crackling of the campfire breaking the silence. Lyrics sat close to the flames, trying to ignore the sharp pain in her leg. The heat from the fire was comforting, but it couldn't take away the lingering fear that had settled deep in her chest. They were far from safe, and she knew it. Her mind kept replaying the encounter with the predator from earlier. Its bloodshot eyes, sharp teeth, and relentless pursuit. If the human hadn't saved her, she would be dead by now. But as much as she wanted to think that the worst was over, she couldn't shake the feeling that something else was lurking in the shadows. There was an unsettling quiet to the jungle tonight. The usual hum of insects and distant animal calls had faded into an eerie silence. Even the air felt still, as if holding its breath. The soldier, whose name she still didn't know, seemed unfazed by the stillness. He sat across from her, his eyes scanning the dark surroundings, his posture relaxed but alert. His hands rested on his knees, and although he appeared calm, Lyrics knew better than to believe that he wasn't aware of the dangers nearby. Humans might be different from what her people had imagined, but they were still survivors, and they didn't survive by being careless. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, the soldier raised a hand. He was signaling for silence. Lyrics immediately fell still, her senses heightened. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her. Something wasn't right. The soldier's voice was low, barely above a whisper. "Get ready," he said. "Something's coming." Lyrics didn't need to be told twice. She instinctively reached for her weapon. But it wasn't there. Her pulse quickened, and her mind raced. She had been trained to expect attacks from other species, to fight back when needed. But this felt different. She had no idea what they were facing now. The soldier's movements were swift and practiced. He stood up slowly, crouching low to the ground, his eyes scanning the darkness. He didn't make a sound, and Lyrics followed his lead. Her heart thudded in her chest as she tried to make sense of the strange stillness surrounding them. Then, in the distance, a low growl broke the silence. Lyrics froze. It was the same growl she had heard earlier, the terrifying sound of the creature that had nearly torn her apart. But this time, it was closer, much closer. Her breath caught in her throat as the growl turned into a snarl, followed by the heavy sound of something moving through the underbrush. "Stay down," the soldier whispered, his voice steady but urgent. He gestured for Lyrics to remain hidden, his eyes locking onto hers for a moment. She could see the determination in his gaze, the focus of a man who had faced death more times than he could count. Lyrics nodded silently, her heart racing as she crouched lower to the ground, trying to make herself as small as possible. The soldier's hand went to his side, and she saw him reach for something. His weapon, no doubt. She had seen him use it before, and it was clear he was skilled with it. But even with a weapon, Lyrics knew they were both at a disadvantage. They were on the creature's turf now. The growl grew louder, and the ground beneath them seemed to tremble with each step the creature took. It was getting closer, moving stealthily but with deadly intent. The jungle was no longer a safe place. It had become a trap. Lyrics's instincts screamed at her to run, but she knew there was nowhere to go. The creature would catch them before they could escape. And then, through the trees, she saw it. At first it was just a shadow, a silhouette against the darkened jungle. But as it moved closer, the shape of the beast became clearer. A massive, hulking creature with sleek black fur, razor-sharp claws, and glowing yellow eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Its muscular body rippled with each movement, and its long tail lashed back and forth, ready to strike. Lyrics's breath caught in her throat. This was no ordinary predator. This was something far more dangerous. It was a hunter, and they were its prey. The soldier didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, his body a blur as he sprinted toward the creature, weapon raised. Lyrics watched in stunned silence as the soldier fired a burst of energy at the creature, hitting it square in the chest. The creature howled in pain, its glowing eyes flashing with rage. But it didn't retreat. Instead, it charged forward with terrifying speed. Lyrics's heart pounded in her chest as she scrambled to her feet, grabbing the nearest object she could use as a weapon. But she knew she wasn't a match for something like that. She had no idea how they could survive this. The soldier continued to fire at the creature, but it seemed impervious to the blasts. It swiped at him with its massive claws, forcing him to dodge out of the way. The soldier moved with incredible speed, narrowly avoiding the creature's strikes. It was a deadly dance, a battle between two forces of nature. Lyrics's mind raced. They had to get out of here. But where? There was nowhere to hide. The creature would find them no matter where they went. Then, to her surprise, the soldier did something unexpected. Instead of running, instead of trying to escape, he turned to face the creature head-on. He was fighting it, not fleeing from it. Lyrics watched in awe as he moved with deadly precision, striking the creature's weak points, dodging its attacks, and keeping the battle in motion. He was fearless, determined to protect her, even if it meant sacrificing himself. For a moment, Lyrics couldn't believe what she was seeing. This human was nothing like the one she had been told about. He wasn't driven by greed or a desire for conquest. He was protecting her, fighting to keep them both alive. The creature roared, its body thrashing as it lunged at the soldier. But the soldier was faster. He ducked and rolled, coming up behind the creature in one swift motion. With a single precise strike, he hit the creature's vulnerable spot, its neck, sending it crashing to the ground with a deafening thud. Lyrics could hardly believe her eyes. The creature was dead. The soldier had killed it. For a moment, there was silence. The jungle around them seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something more. But all that came was the sound of the soldier's heavy breathing, his chest rising and falling with exertion. He stood over the dead creature, his weapon still aimed at its lifeless body, ready for any more surprises. After a few seconds, he lowered his weapon and turned to face Lyrics, his expression unreadable. "You okay?" he asked, his voice calm but tired. Lyrics nodded, her body trembling from the adrenaline rush. She didn't know what to say. She had never felt more alive and more terrified in her entire life. The human had just killed a creature that would have torn her apart in seconds. He had saved her life. Again. "I'm fine," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "But how?" The soldier gave her a tired smile. "I've been through worse," he said simply. "But it's not over yet. We've got to keep moving." Lyrics nodded, her mind still spinning. The real threat wasn't just the creature. It was everything. The jungle, the unknown dangers, the planet they were on. They were still in survival mode, and their only chance of making it out alive was to stick together. And just like that, Lyrics realized something she hadn't fully accepted before. She was no longer alone. The human soldier, for better or worse, was her ally. Together, they would face whatever came next. The air was thick with tension as Lyrics and the soldier trudged through the dense jungle. The night felt like it was closing in on them, the weight of danger pressing from all sides. The fight with the massive predator had left them both exhausted, but there was no time to rest. The soldier was already moving ahead, his sharp eyes constantly scanning the dark, his every step purposeful. Lyrics followed him, trying to ignore the throbbing pain in her leg. She had been injured earlier, but the adrenaline had kept her going. Now she felt every bruise, every cut. It didn't matter, though. They had to keep moving. "Do you think they'll find us?" Lyrics asked, her voice quieter than usual. She hadn't spoken much since the battle, too focused on staying alive. But now, the fear that had been building inside her bubbled to the surface. The soldier glanced back at her, his face hard and unreadable. "They might," he said, "but we won't go down without a fight." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and serious. Lyrics didn't need to ask who they were. The ones who had sent her to this forsaken planet, the ones who had turned their backs on her when she was in need. She had always known that her mission here wasn't going to be easy, but she never expected it to be this deadly. And now, after the attack by the predator and the constant threat of something far worse lurking in the shadows, Lyrics realized the truth. The fight wasn't just against the animals of the jungle. It was against her own people, the ones who had used her as a pawn in their political games. And that made her situation even more complicated. The soldier didn't wait for her to respond. He turned back to the jungle ahead of them, his senses alert. Lyrics tried to ignore the gnawing worry in her gut. She knew that the only reason she was still alive was because of the soldier, his strength, his quick thinking, his bravery. He had saved her multiple times already, and the thought of losing him now, when they were so close to survival, made her sick to her stomach. "I need you to focus," the soldier said, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "We're almost there. Just a little longer, and we'll find a safe spot." Lyrics nodded, even though she wasn't sure what safe meant anymore. Nothing felt safe. The jungle seemed to press in from all sides as if it were alive, watching them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As they continued through the dense undergrowth, Lyric's mind raced. She had never trusted anyone before. Her entire life had been about survival. She had been raised to believe that emotions were a weakness, that trust would only get her killed. But here, in the face of certain death, everything had changed. The soldier had shown her a kind of bravery that went beyond mere survival. He fought for more than just himself. He fought for her. For someone he barely knew. Her chest tightened as she thought about everything that had happened. The soldier's life, his loyalty, everything he had risked to keep her safe. She couldn't help but feel that there was more to him than just a soldier. He was a protector, a warrior with a heart. And no matter how hard she tried to deny it, she was beginning to feel a connection to him, one that went beyond gratitude. Suddenly, the soldier stopped, his head turning sharply to the side. Lyrics froze, her body tensing. She didn't hear anything at first, but then she felt it. A subtle shift in the air, the kind of shift that only happens when danger is nearby. She held her breath, trying to listen, trying to detect any signs of movement. Her hand instinctively went to the weapon at her side, but it was a futile gesture. She wasn't going to be able to do anything against what was coming. The soldier raised a hand, signaling for her to stay silent. Slowly, he crouched low, his eyes scanning the dark. Lyric's heart pounded as she followed his lead, trying to stay as quiet as possible. She could feel the weight of the jungle around them, the thick trees pressing in on them, the shadows hiding things she couldn't see. There was something out there, something dangerous, something that had been waiting for them. It came out of the darkness, moving swiftly and silently, its form barely visible against the trees. Lyric's breath hitched as she recognized the creature from earlier, the massive predator that had attacked them. But this time, it wasn't alone. Lyric's eyes widened as more shadows began to appear, emerging from the trees like phantoms. There were at least 5 of them, each one as large and terrifying as the first. They moved with the grace of hunters, their eyes glowing in the dark, their mouths twisted into vicious snarls. "They're surrounding us," Lyrics whispered, panic rising in her chest. The soldier didn't reply. He was already moving, reaching for his weapon with steady hands, his face set in determination. Lyrics felt her heart race in fear, but she didn't hesitate. She wasn't going to die without a fight. She couldn't. Not when there was still a chance to survive. The soldier fired first, his weapon unleashing a burst of energy that lit up the darkness like lightning. One of the creatures screeched in pain, but it didn't fall. It simply turned and charged, its massive claws swiping through the air. Lyrics barely had time to react. She raised her weapon, firing at the nearest creature. Her shot went wide, missing by inches. She cursed under her breath. The soldier was already moving again, darting to the side as one of the creatures lunged at him. He fired again, and this time, the shot found its mark, hitting the creature in the shoulder. It howled in pain, stumbling back. But there were still too many. The creatures closed in, their growls growing louder, their movements faster. Lyric's pulse was pounding in her ears as she fired again, this time hitting another creature in the chest. It didn't stop. The creature merely paused, its yellow eyes glaring at her, before it continued its charge. "We need a plan," Lyrics shouted, her voice strained. The soldier's eyes flicked toward her for a brief moment, his face grim. "No time for plans," he said. "Just stay close and keep firing." Lyrics nodded, her hands trembling, but her resolve hardening. The creatures were almost on them now, their claws flashing in the dim light. She could feel the air growing heavier, the heat of their bodies making the jungle feel like an oven. She aimed at the closest predator, her finger tightening on the trigger. And then, everything exploded in chaos. The creatures lunged forward, the soldier's weapon firing in rapid succession, the bright bursts of light lighting up the jungle like fireworks. Lyrics fired again, this time hitting one of the creatures square in the head. It fell with a sickening thud, its body crumpling to the ground. But there were still 4 left. The soldier was moving like a shadow, dodging and firing, his movements precise and deadly. He was a warrior, and he wasn't going to let anything stand in his way. But the creatures were relentless. One of them lunged at Lyrics, its claws flashing. She barely managed to dodge in time, but the creature's claws scraped across her side, sending a searing pain through her body. She gasped in shock, but she didn't stop. She raised her weapon and fired point-blank, hitting the creature's throat. It let out a gurgled scream before collapsing at her feet. "Lyrics!" the soldier shouted, his voice full of urgency. She turned to see him battling one of the remaining creatures, his movements swift and calculated. He was injured. She could see the blood on his arm, but he didn't slow down. She couldn't let him do this alone. She couldn't let him sacrifice everything for her. With a cry of determination, Lyrics ran to his side, her weapon raised. Together, they took down the last 3 creatures one by one. It was a brutal, exhausting fight, but when it was over, the jungle was silent once again. Their enemies lay in pieces at their feet. Lyrics was breathing heavily, her body covered in sweat and blood. Her side throbbed where the creature had clawed her. But they had won. They had survived. The soldier collapsed to his knees, panting for breath. "We did it," he said, his voice hoarse. Lyrics looked at him, her heart swelling with a mixture of admiration and gratitude. He had kept his promise. He had protected her. And now, they were both alive together. But even in that moment of victory, Lyrics knew they weren't out of danger yet. There were still more challenges ahead, but for now, they had made it through. And that was all that mattered. The jungle was quiet now. The air, once thick with the sounds of predators and the heavy pulse of danger, had settled into an eerie stillness. Lyrics sat against a tree, her back resting against its rough bark, her eyes closed in exhaustion. The pain from her injuries throbbed, but it didn't seem as important anymore. The battle was over, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe. It was a fleeting moment of peace in a world that had been anything but peaceful. Beside her, the soldier was still standing, though he too had collapsed after the battle. His breathing was deep but uneven, his hands covered in blood, both his own and that of the creatures they had just fought. His eyes were scanning their surroundings warily, but his expression seemed far away, almost as if he were lost in thought. Lyrics couldn't help but watch him, the weight of everything that had happened settling in her chest. She had never expected this. When she had first landed on this planet, she had been a prisoner of her own people, abandoned and sent to die in a hostile world. She had thought that humanity was weak, that they were nothing more than creatures struggling to survive in a universe that had no place for them. But now, everything had changed. The soldier had proven her wrong. The soldier had been her savior, not just in battle, but in a way that she couldn't even fully explain. His strength, his resolve, it had all been so different from everything she had known. She had always been taught that weakness would be punished, that survival came at the cost of emotions. But in him, she had found something that went beyond survival. She had found something that made her question everything she had ever believed. After a long silence, the soldier finally spoke. His voice was low, worn down by the exhaustion and the weight of everything they had just endured. "We did it," he said simply, his words almost like a whisper. Lyrics nodded, though she wasn't sure if he was talking to her or to himself. Either way, the words held meaning. They had made it. Against all odds, they had survived. But as she looked around, the reality of their situation began to sink in. The jungle was dangerous, but it wasn't just the creatures they had fought that they had to worry about. The dangers that lurked beyond this battle were far greater. They had no way of knowing how long they could survive out here, or if they would ever get the help they needed to leave this planet. Lyrics looked up at the soldier, the man who had become her protector in a world that had turned its back on her. His face was bruised, his eyes tired, but there was a strength in him that she couldn't ignore. She had never trusted anyone before, but in that moment, she realized that she trusted him completely. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. There was no bravado in her words, just an honest question, one that had been gnawing at her since the moment they had defeated the last of the predators. The soldier glanced at her, his gaze steady. Now we survive. We keep moving forward. His words were simple, but they carried weight. Lyrics wasn't sure if she believed him, but there was something in his tone that made her want to. He spoke as if there was hope, as if they still had a chance. And in that moment, she realized that maybe she didn't have to face this world alone. Maybe, just maybe, they could make it together. The soldier stood slowly, his movements stiff from exhaustion. He extended a hand to her, his fingers rough from the struggles they had both endured. "We'll make it," he said, his voice filled with quiet certainty. Lyrics hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. She had always relied on herself, always believed that depending on others was a weakness. But now, here was this man, offering her something she had never expected, a future, a chance. And for the first time, Lyrics realized that it wasn't weakness to trust him. It was strength. She took his hand. The soldier pulled her to her feet gently, his touch warm and steady. She was surprised by how comforting it felt, how solid and reassuring. She had never known this kind of support, this kind of companionship. And in that moment, she felt a small flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. They both looked around them, the vast jungle stretching endlessly into the unknown. It was a world full of danger, a world that had nearly killed them both, but it was also a world of possibilities. Lyrics had spent so long thinking that survival was all that mattered, that it was enough to just keep going. But now, with the soldier at her side, she realized that survival wasn't enough. Not anymore. She wanted more. She wanted to live. As they began to walk, Lyrics kept close to the soldier, her steps matching his. It was strange, this feeling of walking alongside someone else, but it didn't feel wrong. In fact, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I never thought I'd be here," Lyrics admitted quietly, her words barely above a whisper. "I never thought I'd find someone like you." The soldier glanced at her, his face softening for the first time since they had met. "I never thought I'd find someone like you either," he said, his voice carrying an unexpected warmth. "But here we are." They walked on in silence, the sounds of the jungle their only company. The soldier didn't say anything more, and Lyrics didn't ask. The words didn't matter anymore. The only thing that mattered now was that they were together. They had survived the worst of it, and though the path ahead was uncertain, they had each other, and that made all the difference. Lyrics thought back to the day when she had first crash-landed on this planet, when she had been terrified and alone. She had believed she was destined to die here, abandoned by everyone, lost in a strange world that had no place for her. But now, with the soldier beside her, she felt as though she had found a new purpose. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't just surviving. She was living. For the first time, Lyrics allowed herself to believe in something greater than just the struggle for survival. She believed in the soldier. She believed in the connection they had forged, the trust that had grown between them. And most of all, she believed that this was only the beginning. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in her life, Lyrics didn't feel afraid. The soldier had given her something she never thought she would have: hope. And as long as they had each other, there was nothing they couldn't face. They kept walking, their steps steady and sure, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. And that was enough.